Well, hey there. Good morning. It's Dr. Barbara Woods, and I'm coming to you live from Manitoba, Canada. And today happens to be Canadian Thanksgiving. So I just want to take a sec to wish all of my Canadian fellow therapists a happy Thanksgiving. And we will get this started. So, we are doing the Great Therapist Transformation, which we're looking at relational neuroscience to develop the skills to move from being kind of a fearful therapist or feeling overwhelmed into feeling calm and confident. And last week we looked at basically the transition from fearful therapist to calm and confident therapist, and we looked at presence as a factor that helps us move in that direction. And presence is basically how you show up in a session and how you're there for the client and you're not distracted by thoughts of what you're going to have for lunch or what's going on in your family, things like that. It's really being really focused and in the session. So today we're going to talk about attunement, which is the second part of the foundation of relational neuroscience. So I'm going to get ready to share my screen and turn the presentation on. And here we are at the Great Therapist Transformation. It's week 2. I've skipped that slide. And if you don't know me, I'm Dr. Barbara Woods. I'm a private practice therapist in Manitoba, Canada, and I work with children, teens, adults, lots of intergenerational trauma, lots of Indigenous clients. And I've also developed a 3-phase approach for dealing with intergenerational trauma that's based on 4 pillars, and that's polyvagal theory, interpersonal neurobiology, child development, and family resilience. So what we cover today is part of the 2 first pillars of polyvagal theory and interpersonal neurobiology. So today we're going to do a short review of that fearful therapist versus that calm confident therapist and how the differences in thinking and behaving are. We're going to do a really quick review of resilience-based psychotherapy, which again is that interpersonal neurobiology, which was developed by Daniel Siegel, and that relational neuroscience, and polyvagal theory, which is from Stephen Porges. And we're going to look at our week 2 content of attunement, which is that second pillar, and how we use these skills with difficult therapy cases and not so difficult therapy cases. So the thoughts of a fearful therapist are that I don't have enough experience. I don't know enough to treat this certain case. And that can be true if you don't have the skills and training. But when we do have the skills and training and we feel like we don't have enough experience, that's where we're kind of moved into this mindset of being a fearful therapist. Also, the thoughts of having to know the one best intervention and have to master that intervention and only that intervention, because there's a lot of interventions that are useful at different periods and for different conditions or situations in therapy, but there's not one best intervention. And the best way to approach it is really through the relationship of therapy, and then your interventions fall in line after that. Thinking that the therapy technique is the most important thing, it's the relationship. So thinking that they need more confidence to be effective. If only I could feel confident in this, I would be more effective. And then kind of thinking that I don't have the qualities or strengths to be a great therapist. I'll always be at this level and there's nothing I can do about it. Like it's these inborn skills or qualities. So what happens for a fearful therapist is they tend to avoid tough cases or situations. So it gets really hard for them to deal with cases that'll really challenge their skills. But by not dealing with those cases, they really don't grow either. So they might get nervous in consultation or supervision and not feel like they can um, put their thoughts out there or problem solve with other therapists. So they kind of tuck into themselves, and then they start to feel inferior with their colleagues. So they won't express themselves. They won't offer ideas or suggestions, sometimes won't collaborate. Then they start to avoid working with parents of children and teen clients. And this is a huge one if you're working with kids with trauma and intergenerational trauma. Is avoiding the parents is one of the worst things you can do, because it's about healing the whole system and not just the child or the teen within that system. And if you're a therapist, you know that we all love our books, but this is a different use of books. So we can love our books and read about different skills, different techniques, and gain a lot through that. But when we're frantically reading books to try to treat a certain situation, that's where we know there's a difficulty. Or if we're kind of taking more and more trainings because we just don't feel like we're good enough or our skills aren't where they need to be. And then even though we do all this stuff, we avoid parents, we avoid difficult cases, we take all these trainings, we read all these books, still feel fearful and like an imposter, like you really don't know what you're doing. So the calm, confident therapist, they're able to attune to their own responses and reactions. These become resources in the therapy sessions. They use those twinges of, uh-oh, to explore deeper, and they push into it or lean into difficult situations rather than kind of tucking, pulling away, and avoiding. They tend to collaborate with parents, and this is what the intergenerational trauma program gives a huge framework for collaborating with parents, helping them develop skills to calm that family nervous system down. So they feel great interacting with colleagues and supervisors. They actively participate. They may seek other people out to run things by of cases. They engage in self-care. So this is a big one, especially with this pandemic, where we're all hit in our personal lives by the pandemic, and we're also hit in our offices with the more extreme impacts of this pandemic and how much it's affecting the mental health of our clients. So engaging in self-care is critical, and this is one thing that a calm, confident therapist always does. And they experience kind of a mindful curiosity with difficult cases. It's not a retreat and a anxious nervousness. It's like, wow, this is going to be really interesting to work with, instead of, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? So that's the calm, confident therapist. And how do we get to that? Well, I like to base everything on evidence-based principles. So I tend to rely on interpersonal neurobiology and polyvagal theory. It's all based on the neuroscience of the brain, has a lot of research behind it. And if you can learn to apply it in therapy, it becomes a really effective tool. And it's also great for parenting and supporting kids with trauma. So we're going to look at these first two pillars as we look at attunement today. So again, a review: interpersonal neurobiology combines neuroscience and relationships to promote growth and healing. So it's using that relational neurobiology to guide your sessions. And polyvagal theory is a foundation really for all therapies. If you're not aware of where a client's autonomic nervous system is and how to help them to regulate back into social engagement or the window of tolerance, the therapy interventions are going to be less effective. So polyvagal theory also increases therapist attunement and presence, because we have to regulate ourselves as well. So it actually gives us a foundation to co-regulate our clients, especially in those difficult or overwhelming circumstances. And here we are at relational neuroscience. And this again comes from Daniel Siegel, where he talks about when you combine presence, attunement, and resonance skills in the therapist, you automatically end up getting trust with the client. So this is really important as the foundation of therapy, but we kind of lose these skills when we start to get anxious or overwhelmed or just kind of burned out or not practicing enough self-care. So it's always good to return to these skills and make sure that we're really honing in on presence, attunement, resonance, and developing that trust. So we're going to look at what really is attunement. So attunement really, it blossoms out of being present and having that presence. And it's that second building block of relational neuroscience. So if the therapist's ability to focus attention and have a clear perception of what the client is experiencing, both inside the therapy room and in the outside world. So this sounds like a big thing to do, and it can be, but it's more about pulling on our own experience, our experience with other clients, our clinical training, and what the client is saying in front of us, and kind of having that as a ready resource for understanding what the client is going through and really being mindfully present and attuned to what they're dealing with. It also requires that we check in with them. We can't just kind of go off on a tangent and think that we know what they're experiencing without checking in. So the benefits of attunement for a client are being seen and felt. So many of our clients don't have this experience on a regular basis, may have never experienced the relational interaction of being seen and heard and felt. So it provides this sense for them and really helps them feel like somebody gets them, somebody knows who they are and still cares about them or is still willing to support them. It also creates an openness. So the client, this is a really important part. So therapy becomes like a container that the client can explore the paradox of being both vulnerable and safe at the same time. So they can feel safe in the therapy relationship because they're seen and felt and in a non-intrusive, comfortable way for the client, but also can talk about how much they are impacted by difficult things or how much they feel like they're not a good person or whatever it is that that client is experiencing. The container of therapy provides that space where they can kind of widen that window of tolerance by being both vulnerable and safe at the same time. So you want it to be safe, but not too safe, and you don't want it to be unsafe. So it provides a change in self-understanding. So we learn about ourselves through relationships, and we learn about who we are, how we're valued in the relationships that we have. So some clients have relationships that really aren't healthy. They're with people that have never been healthy, never been good influences in their lives. And they end up feeling like they're not a good person or they're not worthy. But the therapeutic relationship can shift that and help them understand that they do have value, they do have worth, and it's maybe the relationships that aren't supporting the finding of that in those relationships. So it'll change how the client perceives and really experiences themselves. So attunement is also based on mirror neurons. And for people who don't really understand or don't have that language, mirror neurons, there's a circuit in the brain that when I pick up my cup of coffee and I take a drink, which I just faked, and I take a drink, and your brain, there's a circuit in your brain that is firing off drinking coffee. And your brain doesn't really distinguish between actually drinking coffee and seeing somebody drink coffee. So when we are interacting with people, our mirror neurons are taking in and kind of absorbing what the other person is doing. So if it's a look of disgust or despair, we may kind of feel that disgust or despair because our mirror neurons are activated. So the therapy relationship, it relies a lot on these mirror neurons. And attunement is one of these major reasons that it relies on this circuit. So the therapist attunes to the client, and the client then attunes to the therapist's compassion, because we should always have that and should always kind of express that. That's part of resonance, which we'll get into next week. But it creates this interaction where we're attuning to the client, we're hearing them, we're seeing them, and we're giving them positive regard and compassion. Their mirror neurons look at that compassion and experience a different sense of themselves, and it's more compassionate. So they have this new experience that can lead to greater self compassion because of how the therapist was compassionate and how this impacted the mirror neurons. So they end up seeing themselves quite differently through the therapy relationship. The other part of attunement that's really, really important is therapist self-attunement. So using yourself in your responses as a resource in the therapy sessions. And if you've taken any training with Lisa Dion in her intervention for working with kids, she talks about how kids will hook you, and they'll do something in the session where you'll feel kind of like, oh, or a little twinge of anxiety. That's actually their experience that they're kind of almost like transmitting to you, but it's those mirror neurons and this whole relational neurobiology that allows that process to happen. So the more attuned we are with ourselves helps us attune better with the client as well. And there's some real benefits to this. So therapists are healthier when they can self-attune because it prevents stress and burnout. We use our responses as a resource rather than trying to focus on the worksheet that we're working on or the intervention that we're doing at the expense of this. Something doesn't feel right here, because it probably doesn't feel right to the client either. So it prevents stress and burnout, creates a greater awareness of our own responses and the areas of impact from doing therapy. So I've had people say to me, like, that all I do is sit around and talk to people all day. How can that be hard? Well, it's very hard because of the impact. So our mirror neurons are also absorbing what the client is talking about and doing. So we have to be really cautious and careful in taking care of ourselves, because there's a huge impact of doing therapy. There's a lot of burnout. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of secondary or vicarious trauma that can happen for therapists. So therapist self-attunement also creates a trusting of yourself. So that's the movement from fearful to calm and confident. Because when we have greater self-trust, we're more likely to be open, objective, we'll have more accurate observations. The relationship with the client will be more solid, and everything will flow in a very, very healthy, good way. And there's positive benefits as well with self-attunement, that there's therapists who have a high degree of self-attunement and care for themselves have a greater attitude towards their work, and they also have greater clinical intuition. Clinical intuition sounds like a little woo-woo or hokey, but really what that means is it's taking all of your personal experiences of feeling let down or any trauma, things like that, with your book knowledge of interventions, with the client's experience, with other clients' experience, and it's developing a greater sense of knowing or intuition when you're working with one specific person. So there's huge positive benefits to self-attunement. So there's a 3-step process for therapists to self-attune, and this is from a book by Geller called Self-Attunement, and there's a reference at the end of the slides. So this 3-step process includes bracketing, visualizing their emotions, and mirroring their movements. So bracketing is it sounds like we should be able to do this anyway, but we're human. And sometimes things from our own lives, from the office, from the client we had before, will interfere and will kind of come into our thoughts as we're working with another person. So, bracketing is really putting aside our own experiences, day-to-day experiences, or stressful things that's happened that day, stressful things in the world, or our judgments of the client situation. So you shouldn't have done that, or why did you think that, kind of thing. It's setting aside all of those judgments and all of our experiences to get this really clear sense of the client and the client's experience. So it can be sometimes easier said than done if you're not practicing self-care and you're experiencing a high degree of stress. Bracketing can be quite difficult. Can also be difficult if you see clients back to back and don't have downtime, at least like 10 minutes in between. It also can be difficult with the things in the world that are going on. Or if you have a client who has been in a lot of distress the session before or earlier in the day, or you get a phone call that somebody's in distress, bracketing can be really difficult, but it's also very important for that person that we're sitting with at that time. So the second step of self-attunement is visualizing their emotions. So getting that felt sense for the client's emotional life and experiences by visualizing or imagining their emotions. There is a caveat to this and a warning that will come in the slides later. But just visualizing their emotional life puts us a lot more in touch with what they may be experiencing, and it gives us kind of a wealth of kind of energy to work with. And then the third step is mirroring their movements. So this is engaging the motor neurons, which are movement, by respectfully using similar movements. So this is not mocking. It's not being really kind of intrusive with this. It might be something as gentle as watching the client's breathing pattern and breathing in synchrony with them. So it could be gestures or facial expressions. Like if they go, I couldn't believe it. I didn't know what happened. And if you just do kind of the same movement, it helps develop that interbrain synchronization. So that's that relational neuroscience of attunement. And we're kind of moving through this together. Here comes the caution. Therapists are at really high risk of vicarious trauma, particularly if you're working with clients that have really difficult trauma histories, are highly impacted, or have a similar trauma to something that you may have experienced. So those all raise the risk of vicarious trauma. In those situations, it's really important for the therapist to pay attention to their own felt sense and what's happening without visualizing the trauma itself. So attunement with trauma is not visualizing the trauma. It's visualizing either the impact or watching the impact on your own felt sense. Because if we start to visualize the trauma, it's going to be more likely result in vicarious trauma. I know I've experienced this. We have, for the local people who are watching this, we have an intersection that's at Highway 1 and 16 that I think one summer 9 people were killed there. Just freak accidents that were horrible, but we see the people who were witnesses. We see family members, we see first responders, we see people in the community who may have driven by. So if you have all these people describing the same accident and you're visualizing it, there's some of these accidents that I drive through that intersection and I look in a certain spot and that's what I see. So, and it's because in a session I've visualized what the person was describing rather than their experience or my own experience. So this is a really important caution with working with trauma and using attunement. So instead, What we do to prevent vicarious trauma is, instead of attuning and visualizing the client's experience, what they saw, what they heard during a trauma, is to pay attention to the words that they use, the vocal tone and expression. So if they start to talk really kind of fast and pressured and they get a little shaky, you know they're kind of in a sympathetic activation, like fight or flight. If they start to describe a really bad accident and it goes flat, you know they've kind of dropped into dorsal vagal, or kind of a freeze or numb kind of state. So watching that vocal tone and expression is really important. Watching their breathing patterns, if they start to breathe quicker and more shallow, that would be a sympathetic activation. If they start to breathe shallow and not very much, that's more of your dorsal vagus, just like a shutdown. Watching their body posture, in their eyes and facial expression. So this is still attunement, but we're not attuning to the traumatic event. Very important. So another part of attunement is in what they call implicit sensing. And implicit is outside awareness. So it's not something that we recall, like where I live, where I work. It's like the motions and things needed to drive from here to my office. Or just kind of a sense of knowing based on experience, but we can't really put our finger on it. So if we use an embodied awareness or internal self-attunement, it helps us observe our own emotions, our body sensations. We're much more aware of what's happening. We're aware of our breathing patterns, images that come to mind, words that we think to ourselves, and insights that may be on the verge or edge of clarity. And what this is we'll experience certain things. We're attuned to the client. We'll experience certain things that might be part of their experience. So if they have a situation where they're describing something that happened in an interaction with a family member, they're arguing, and they roll their eyes in session, or you kind of have a sense of, oh, that must have been so frustrating, and you have this image of them like rolling their eyes, you might say, that may have been so frustrating and disappointing. Did you feel that, or did you catch yourself rolling your eyes? And they may say, oh yeah, and the other person caught me too, and it made it worse. So it's these things that are kind of on the verge or edge of clarity. And that's because they're implicit, they're not really known, but there's something that we're tapping into, either in our experiences with other clients, our training, or what the client is experiencing with us. And these are really important parts of attunement because it helps the client really feel seen and heard and understood. So this is a short practice that you can use for embodied awareness. And again, this is from Geller. So the first step is to just close your eyes and take in 3 deep breaths. Reflect on a conversation that was difficult and attend to what you feel in your body when you recall this. And then attend to what you visualize when you recall this conversation. And then just allow any images, words, or insights to appear. And then when you're ready to, when you feel like you've done this visualization enough, you return to the sensations of your breath and transition out of the practice back to your day. So you could use this between sessions. You could use this to kind of disconnect from one session and move into the other. You could use it before a session to try to connect more with like what the last session was about, and then check in with the client with kind of wanting to revisit what happened if that's where they're at as well. So this again is in, whoops, went a little too fast there. This is in Geller's book, The Practical Guide to Cultivating Therapeutic Presence. So it's just a really nice, gentle way to have that embodied awareness in sessions. So that is the session on attunement, and very important. If you are a brain spotting therapist, you will know that attunement is really, really important to brain spotting and picking up on those little tiny factors that the client may not be aware of or not speaking of, and to check in with them or to be present and provide that container. So, next week, we will be talking about resonance, and that will happen October 18th, Monday at 9 o'clock. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I hope you have a beautiful day. Again, to my Canadian friends and family, happy Thanksgiving and have a wonderful day.